Years ago at Moody Bible Institute, one afternoon I had finished all my classes. Then I went to my office and was relaxing when the telephone rang. On the other end was my next door neighbor, Dan. And Dan said to me, "You must drop whatever you're doing and get home as soon as possible. Your wife has just fallen from a height of 10 feet backwards and landed headfirst on solid concrete, and she was knocked unconscious. She can neither move nor speak, and an ambulance is now rushing her to the emergency room of a nearby hospital." Now, the only transportation home that day was the slow commuter train, and it took me an hour to get home. And in that hour, I did two things. I began to pray for my wife, and then I began to prepare myself for what I might find when I got to the hospital. Now, a few years before that, a friend of mine who was a professional construction worker, he also fell from a height of 10 feet and landed on his head, and the blow immediately killed him. So I realized that upon getting to the hospital and locating my wife, I might find her dead, or alive but permanently paralyzed, or perhaps alive and suffering only a minor injury. And while praying, it must have been the Spirit of God that led me to our passage today, which concerns, as you can see on the screen, birds and believers. And our passage is Matthew 10, verses 29 through 31. And as I begin to reflect on this passage, in fact, I want us to take a look at verse 29 right here. "Are not sparrows sold too for a penny, and yet not one of them will?" And here's the word that really grabbed my attention. "Not one of them will fall to the ground." Now, the Greek literally says, "without your Father." So let me get rid of apostrophe S and consent. So literally that verse says, "Are not sparrows sold too for a penny, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father." So now, as I meditated on that, I began to think biblically. That is to say, I began to think correctly. If it's true that a bird cannot fall to the ground without God's consent, how much more true is it that my wife cannot fall to the ground without God's consent? Susan fell. Heaven must have allowed it. Therefore, she will not be injured to any greater extent than what God allows. And if I get to the hospital and find that she has died, then I trust God with that decision that He made, realizing that God has a greater claim on my wife than I do. If she's terribly paralyzed the rest of her life, again, she and I will trust God with that. Well, when I got to the hospital and I located her, I was just relieved. She was alive. She wasn't paralyzed. She wasn't seriously injured. She suffered a terrible gash in her scalp, which required 18 stitches to close. And they let me take her home about 2 a.m. in the morning, and they said, "Now, you can let your wife go to sleep, but you must wake her up every 2 or 3 hours so that she doesn't lapse into a coma." And so we were very fortunate to have suffered just a minor injury. Now, my wife told me that when she was in the attic of our garage and lost her grip and started falling backwards, she said she realized that she was in trouble. But all the way down, she had peace in her heart, confident that she was in the hand of God. And she said that when her head struck the concrete, the blow was so severe, she felt nothing. And as lying on the ground after she hit it with her head, she felt like she was floating on a cloud. And then our 3 children, small children, gathered around her and they were speaking to her, but Sue said she couldn't speak. And Sue said, "I knew that I had been injured. I didn't know how badly I was. But again, I just had the peace of God in my heart, knowing that I was still in the care of God." Now, this passage concerns God's protection of you and me. Now let's just go ahead and read through these verses before we get into it in a detailed manner and just refresh our memory over what they say. what these verses say. So again, verse 29, Jesus is speaking to his disciples. Now he's about to send them out across Israel on an evangelistic preaching campaign, and he's got some tough news for them. But let's read through these verses. Verse 29. Are not sparrows sold too for a penny, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father's consent? Verse 30. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. So stop fearing. You are worth more than many sparrows. Okay. Now here is the context of our passage. Remember, Jesus is getting them ready to send them out on a preaching and evangelistic campaign. And he says in Matthew 10 and verse 16, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Where sheep are, wolves are nearby. 17, beware of men, for they will deliver you over to the courts and flog you in their synagogues. 18, you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. 19, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given you in that hour. 21, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. 22, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. 23, and when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next town. So as the disciples hear this, I'm sure that anxiety, apprehension, fear begin to seep into their souls. And they're wondering, are we going to survive this evangelistic campaign? Jesus knows their cages rattle, so now he's going to speak a much needed word of assurance to them. Okay, so let's take verse 29. Again, knowing the disciples' fear, Jesus is addressing that fear. In verse 29, says, are not sparrows sold too for a penny? Now, we're going to see that there are a number of figures of speech in these three verses. What is a figure of speech? It is a rhetorical device. Now, the word rhetorical pertains to either writing or speaking. So a figure of speech is a rhetorical device used to heighten or intensify meaning. And in the first line of verse 29, we have a question. Let's begin with this negative adverb uki, which means not. Now, often when uki begins a sentence, it's going to raise a question that expects a positive answer, an affirmative answer. I want you to look closely at the punctuation mark at the end of the first clause in verse 29. What looks like to you and me a semicolon in Greek is the question mark, the sign of a question mark. So the Lord is asking a question here. Now, this is not a real question. The figure of speech here is eroticus of affirmation. What is that? This is an insincere question that does not seek information, but emphatically makes a point. Though rhetorical, it expects a positive answer. Yes, sparrows are sold too for 1 penny. The point is they are so cheap they must not be important. All right, let's go back. Let's go back here, and you'll notice in parentheses I'm saying that literally. The first line asks a question. Are not sparrows sold too for a penny? So now what I want to do, now that we recognize we have eroticus, an insincere question, not seeking information, but to make a point, I want to remove the figure of speech and I want to put the first clause, I want to translate it in a straightforward manner like this. Sparrows are indeed sold too for a penny. We would say they're so cheap. They're a dime a dozen. And again, the point of that question is they're so cheap that they must not be important. Now, I want to go, the next thing I want to do is go to the second line and the very first word, kai. This is an adversative conjunction and it's going to denote a contrast with the idea these little birds are cheap, they must not be important. And this verse, this adversative conjunction is going to say, oh yes, they are important to God. And yet, not one of them will fall to the ground. Now, so my kai, I'm going to translate, and yet. Although a sparrow is financially inexpensive and seemingly insignificant, yet this little creature is very important to its creator. Now, in verse 29, we have two more figures of speech. And the first figure of speech has to do with this word right here. And yet not one of them will fall to the ground. Now, if we just take that literally, it means, well, a bird was sitting on a limb, and he didn't mean to, but he dozed to sleep, and he lost his grip and fell from the limb to the ground. That's not what he's talking about. Nor is Jesus saying this little bird was coming in for a landing on a fence, and he misjudged the fence, and he fell to the ground. So we have here what's called metonymy of effect. What is that? One word or expression is put in place of another. Here, the effect is put in place of its cause. The effect, the result, the outcome is to fall to the ground. What caused this little bird to fall to the ground? It died. So notice how I'm going to translate this. I'm going to remove the figure of speech, and yet not one of them will die. Now, the Greek literally says, without your father. Not one of these little birds will die without your father, and that leads us to the other figure of speech called metonymy of the subject. The subject is either an object, or in this case, it's a person, God. So the subject is put for an adjunct, something related to the subject, and that is God's consent. So your father is put for his consent for the bird to die. So notice now how I'm going to translate the last two lines. And yet not one of them will die without your father's consent. Now the next verse turns from birds in verse 29 to believers in verse 30. And you'll notice I have put in black italics and underlined the very first word right here, humon, because of this figure of speech, hyperbaton. Hyperbaton is removing a word from its normal position in a clause. Now, humon means your. And so since I put it in bold italics here and underline it in my translation, I'm going to put it also in bold italics and underline it here. So humon should be right here in its position in the clause. But for emphasis, hyperbaton is going to lift humon from its normal position and make it the very first word. Why? As a person is reading this, that word humon just jumps out and grabs his attention to make a point. Okay, so hyperbaton is removing a word from its normal position in a clause and putting it in an unusual position, and the purpose is to attract the reader's attention and stress some point. So here, your God means, the point is, God may not count the hairs of an unbeliever, but he definitely does it with the hairs of your head. Who's Jesus addressing? His disciples, the Father's children. And what Jesus is saying is, you are so precious to God. That little sparrow is so precious to God. It can't die and fall to the ground without heaven's consent. You are so precious to God that God has counted all of your hairs. Now, let's raise the question. God's counted your hairs. What does he do with the information? If he counts your hairs and does nothing with the information, what good would it do you? So we're going to have another figure of speech here. Let's suppose I ask you to sit down in a chair, and I want you to give me the rest of the day and let me carefully, slowly count every hair on your head. Now, experts tell us that the typical person has about 600,000 hairs on his or her head. So now I take the rest of the day and count all the hairs on your head, and let's assume I'm accurate down to the very hair, and I learn, as I count, that you have 600,300 and let's say 25 hairs on your head. Now I know exactly how many hairs you have on your head. What good does that do you? It doesn't do you any good. This is purely academic. I know how many hairs are on your head. I don't do anything with the information, and so that information does me no good. It does you no good. So we don't want to interpret this literally. So we have another figure of speech called metonymy the adjunct. An adjunct, what is signified by an action, counting the hairs on your head, is put in lieu of that action. So here's the key. To number the hairs on a person's head signifies protecting each hair that has been counted. So now look at my translation of this verse. But even the hairs of your head, maybe not the hairs of unbelievers, but the hairs of your head are all numbered. That is, God protects every single hair He has counted on your head. We sometimes hear the expression, now, you take care. I'm talking to a babysitter. You make sure you take care of my child while you're babysitting. My wife and I are out for the evening. Do not let a hair on his head be harmed. Is that clear? Okay, so not to let a hair on the head of my child be harmed means I want him perfectly safe, absolutely and totally safe in your care. Now, in light of all that's been said, verse 31 is going to draw a conclusion. And it's going to do it with this word, the second word right here. Un is a postpositive conjunction. It's not allowed to stand first. It stands second, but you translate it firstly. And I'm going to translate it with the inferential conjunction so. So, this inferential conjunction, looking back to the two previous verses, from them draws a conclusion, and that conclusion is stated as a negative command, so meaning if a bird can't die without God's consent, neither can you. God has numbered every hair on your head. In fact, He protects every hair on your head that is counted. And the very fact that God counts and protects every hair on your head, what does that indicate? How incredibly intense, careful, comprehensive is God's protection of you. When God wants you saved, His protection extends to every single supposedly insignificant hair on your head. Now, you and I, a hair on our head, in fact, a bunch of hairs on our head are not that important. Neither you nor I would hesitate to reach up and yank a few hairs out and just let them fall to the ground. Why? They're not important to us. And if we pull some out, we know that they'll grow back. They'll be replaced by others. But while some hairs on our head are not important to us, they are very important to God. So, stop fearing. You are worth more than many sparrows. Now, I also want to point out this word right here, humes. So stop fearing you. Now here the word you is being stressed. Now notice and here's the word for you, humes. I put it in bold italics, underline it because emphasis falls on it. Now let me isolate humes, translate it you, so we can focus on it. Now here's what I want to say. Triple emphasis rests on this personal pronoun. How so? Firstly, the figure of speech assumed-deton omits a causal conjunction like for or because that justifies the prohibition to stop fearing. Now here's the command, so stop fearing. Now what we expect right here is either an FOR, for, or a causal conjunction like because that would give the reason why you should stop fearing. Stop fearing for you're worth more than many sparrows. Stop fearing because you're worth more than many sparrows. And what is the point of assumed-deton when you leave out a connecting conjunction that links two clauses? Jesus is so eager to get to line 3 that He deliberately leaves out the causal conjunction, not for you are worth more, because you are worth more, just you are worth more than many sparrows. Second emphasis on humes. Humes is unnecessary since the word you can be taken from the last 3 letters in the verb diaferiti. So we can cross out humes. It's not necessary. And these last three letters are a pronominal suffix, second person plural, that mean you. So these three letters are sufficient to translate you are worth more. But when the writer goes ahead and writes the emphatic pronoun when it's not necessary, he's putting great stress on this word you. And so the third emphasis is this: humes should appear as the initial word in the final clause. In other words, humes ought to go right here where my word you in the English translation is. But Hyperbaton places it last for extra stress. The idea, perhaps it could be said of other people that they are worth more than many sparrows, but this fact can without a doubt be said of you, the Lord's people. You are definitely worth more than many sparrows. So we have a threefold emphasis on humes, and I've indicated that firstly, by putting it in black, secondly, by putting it in italics, and thirdly, by underlining it. Okay, so here is my finished final translation. Verse 29, sparrows are indeed sold 2 for a penny, and yet not one of them will die without your Father's consent. Verse 30, but even the hairs of your head are all protected. So stop fearing. You are worth more than many sparrows. Here is God's will for you and me. This was Jesus' will for those disciples. He's sending them out among wolves. They're going to have a hard time. They're going to be beat. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to be put in jail. And they're wondering, are we going to come out of this evangelistic ministry with our body intact, still possessing our lives, or are we going to be killed? So let's go from exposition to application. Number one, it is our responsibility to do everything possible to ensure our personal safety. Part of God's provision for our safety is using what He put between our ears, good common sense. We do have some responsibility for our safety. But number two, most of the responsibility for our safety, fortunately for us, lies on God's shoulders. Now, no doubt, every person viewing this video, like myself, we've been in situations and maybe we didn't know it. But there are times when we did know it, when we were doing everything we could to keep ourselves safe, and yet we were almost injured or killed, and we would have been except for the intervening hand of God. He decided it was not our time to go. Thirdly, we are indestructible until our work on earth is finished. When our task here is done, we have no more reason to remain here, and then the Lord puts us to sleep, and we graduate from earth to heaven. Fourthly, if it's true that God protects every hair on our head, then we need not fear for our safety. The Lord prohibits our anxiety. He wants us peaceful at heart. And He wanted those disciples peaceful at heart as He was sending them out in the midst of wolves. Not too long ago, I had a student at Moody. He was graduating. He wanted to be a youth pastor, and he said, I've been looking for a safe place to go and serve in a church as a youth pastor. I didn't want a dangerous place. And then he said, I realized that I was not trusting God. So my wife and I have been looking for a place overseas that's very needy to have people minister to young people for Christ, but in a difficult, in a dangerous situation. Now that's commendable. He's not asking for trouble. He's willing to go to a dangerous place for the sake of those young people, for the cause of Christ, and trust in the Lord. So, Father, it's so good to know that our life and breath are in your hand, and that we will be, each of us, on this earth only as long as you want us here. Not one day more, and certainly not one day less. Now, your will for the disciples is the same for us. You don't want us to fear about our personal safety. We realize, Lord, that we have some responsibility in it. May we be diligent to do what we can to keep ourselves safe. But we're grateful that most of the responsibility for our safety is on you. So give us peace about our personal safety in Jesus' name. Amen. May you have the peace of Christ in your heart regarding your safety, regarding the safety of your loved ones.